Hello, this is Canna Talks with Dr. Ingrid. If you like our content, please click the like button and subscribe to our channel below. Now, let's get straight to our video, a brief history of cannabis in the US. Let's start with where cannabis actually comes from. It originated a very, very long time ago, 12,000 years in fact, on the fertile, nutrient-rich dump sites of prehistoric hunters and gatherers. It has been around for a very, very long time. And it can grow virtually anywhere, hence the nickname weed. It is believed to have come from Mongolia and southern Siberia. It then spread to Korea, then to India, from there to Europe, then to Africa, then to South America, and eventually to North America in the 19th century. Records dating back as far as 4000 BC show that it was used as an anesthetic by many cultures. Later on, medieval Germans and even Vikings used it to ease the pain of childbirth and even toothaches, for example. Its use as a medicine was well established. Cannabis made its way to the southwestern United States early in the 20th century. It was brought in by Mexicans fleeing the savagery of the Mexican Revolution. This is probably the cannabis origin story most people are familiar with. Mexicans used it mostly for recreation and relaxation, and they smoked it, which was new and surprising to most Americans. But wait, wasn't there something about cannabis and the early colonies even before the Mexican Revolution? Yes, that's true. Cannabis was called Indian hemp back then and was very popular. It was used as a cash crop to make rope, clothing, paper, etc. Early on, it was even used to support the crown. George Washington had over 100 hemp plants at Mount Vernon, and Jefferson had them at Monticello. However, a story circling the internet that Thomas Jefferson was a pot smoker is decidedly false. Hemp was important, but not for recreation. Cannabis, hemp, what is actually the difference? Sometimes people use these words interchangeably, but are they? Well, they are cousins, and they belong to the same species, but they do differ in the amount of THC they contain. Cannabis contains more than 0.3%, hemp contains 0.3% or less. As a matter of fact, hemp is used to derive CBD, which has many medical uses and does not cause a high, and it is therefore much less controversial. By the 19th century, cannabis had made its way into the arsenal of the 19th century physician. Pharmacology textbooks of the time recommend using it for pain, anxiety, nausea, insomnia, and so on. Its medical uses were actually not really different from today's recommendations. One textbook even suggests that physicians should keep, quote, cannabis indica in stock at all times, unquote, and should not fail to carry it in their doctor's bag for house calls. Medical books describe cannabis rather matter-of-factly, its appearance, smell, taste, and its side effects. In other words, it was far from taboo and was immensely useful. So when did it become a villain then? An evil weed? Well, it is a story of stereotyping and prejudice. Between 1910 and 1920, approximately 890,000 Mexicans legally immigrated to the United States to escape the wreckage of their Civil War and to make a new life here. They brought with them unfamiliar customs, including the habit of smoking cannabis. This disturbed many people who then vilified Mexicans, and with them their substance of choice. When prejudice takes hold, this gives rise to racism, and this poisoned the population over time. So why do I keep saying cannabis and not marijuana? Because cannabis is simply a botanical name and has no negative connotations, that's why. Prior to 1910, the word marijuana essentially did not exist in American culture. It is not clear where exactly the word comes from, but it is clear that it was purposely propagated to make cannabis sound foreign or alien, not something decent 20th century folk would like to be associated with. From then on, there was a literal campaign against cannabis, and it worked. Some sources say that by 1915, Utah was the first state to have outlawed cannabis. But Massachusetts, and afterwards a handful of other states, actually beat Utah by banning it in 1911. In any case, by 1931, cannabis was outlawed in 29 states. The Great Depression helped with this. Massive unemployment, increased public resentment, and also fear of Mexican immigrants whipped the public into a frenzy. Somebody had to be blamed. Why not Mexicans, instead of poor agricultural management and politics? With the passing of the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, the word marijuana became part of common American English, and this has stuck ever since. The man largely responsible for this was Harry Anslinger, who was the first commissioner of the brand new Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Anslinger was a passionate bigot and racist. He employed a deliberate misinformation campaign that included coercion and lies. In other words, he was a top sterling politician for whom no act was too low or too vile to see his agenda come to life. He has been called the J. Edgar Hoover of narcotics, and that with good reason. At the same time, movies like Reefer Madness, the plot of which belongs in Grimm's fairy tales, terrified people into believing that even one-time use of cannabis would turn the user into a zombie or moral derelict. Anslinger's right-hand man in all of this was William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper magnate. He hated minorities at least as much as Anslinger did, and according to one biography, he used his chain of newspapers to aggravate racial tensions at every opportunity. He brazenly confabulated stories and was an important part of the ongoing fear and smear campaign. As a result of all of this, a time of willful arrests for minor cannabis offenses began, for which cruel punishments were imposed, particularly and purposely, on non-white Americans. Against this stood the Laguardia Committee Report of 1944 from the New York Academy of Medicine. Fiorello LaGuardia was highly intelligent, socially aware, and forward-thinking. He was also strongly opposed to the Marijuana Tax Act and commissioned the study the committee report was based on. The actual study was called The Marijuana Problem in the City of New York. The committee found that cannabis is not physically addictive, is not a gateway drug, and does not lead to crime. Anslinger was enraged and declared the report as unscientific, and continued his witch hunt. Naturally, people being people, underground use of cannabis continued, not just despite, but because of the prohibition. Particularly musicians, writers, poets, and other artists did not want to be deprived of cannabis, which they felt enhanced their creativity and made life bearable. Most visible was the Beat generation of the 1950s, which consisted of a group of American post-World War II writers and became quite openly associated with cannabis use. In turn, this evolved into the hippie and counterculture movement of the 1960s. By 1967, when 35,000 young men were drafted every month, the hippie scene and counterculture movements merged in their desire to legalize cannabis. Vastly different people with different ideologies and belief systems connected over the use of cannabis. In the resistance to the Vietnam War, smoking cannabis was seen as a political act. As a result, the conservative elite began to believe that in order to crush the anti-war movement, the government had to go after their drug of choice. Q2, Nixon's War on Drugs. It began in 1971, when he declared drug abuse to be public enemy number one. He had previously signed the Controlled Substances Act in 1970, which listed cannabis as a Schedule I drug with maximum abuse potential and no medical use, which is clearly untrue. To be fair, while Nixon clearly was not a friend of hippies, anti-war protesters, or minorities, he truly detested drugs and felt they were all harmful. He was also concerned about drug use in the military. Initially, he was focused on prevention and rehabilitation, but this was to change soon. Nixon had appointed the Schaeffer Commission, which was supposed to investigate cannabis. But he was not looking for an objective report. He was looking for a weapon to use in his war on drugs. In 1972, the Schaeffer Commission reported that cannabis is at least as safe as alcohol and recommended ending its prohibition. Nixon was furious when Raymond Schaeffer published his results despite being told not to. The actual name of Schaeffer's report was Marijuana, a Signal of Misunderstanding, by the way. Not surprisingly, it was completely ignored by the administration, which plowed on undeterred, fighting public enemy number one. When all was said and done, by 1973, the Rockefeller drug laws swept the nation, mandating lengthy prison sentences for minor offenses. Fast forward to the 1980s. Ronald Reagan picked up the torch and greatly expanded the war on drugs. He was not interested in treatment or prevention and was primarily focused on criminal punishment. In 1984, the Just Say No campaign began with Reagan's wife, Nancy, as a spokesperson. Neither Ronald nor Nancy had any real understanding of science or how to effectively deal with the problem of drug addiction. As a result, the Just Say No campaign was totally tone-deaf, naive, as if it was so easy to just say no without any kind of social reform or access to treatment, and is deservedly considered an utter failure. Under Reagan, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which allocated $1.7 billion to the war on drugs. In reality, though, a total of $21.5 billion were spent. Reagan was a big spender when he wanted to be. Per the Drug Policy Alliance, the United States spends $51 billion annually on all initiatives associated with this today. And in 2021, after 50 years of waging the war on drugs, a cumulative total of $1 trillion has been spent, which includes billions of dollars for cannabis convictions. A success? Hardly. This concludes part 1 of a brief history of cannabis in the US. Obviously, this was really just a brief synopsis. There are literally countless articles on the internet. The description below also contains a few links that you can click on for more information. Please post questions and comments for us. Also, please don't forget to click like and subscribe to our channel. See you in part 2 of this video, which will take us from the 1980s to the present time and look at a lot of political wheeling and dealing. Ciao!